think we're getting started here. I'm seeing a lot of buzzing in the hallway. Yeah, excellent. Okay. Well, thanks for joining us this morning. I'm Matt Rojansky, director here of the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center. This is an event, as you've seen in the materials, co-sponsored with the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security here in Washington, which has been our partner in a number of efforts I'll say a word about in a moment, and with the Global Europe Program, which is now headed by Baroness Ashton, who's speaking with us this morning. I'm very pleased to be able to present a topic that's always timely and always important. I think this morning the importance and timeliness is particularly acute. None other than the Honourable Jane Harmon has just joined us. Jane, come on up to the front. The Kennan Institute's very proud of our new partnership with the Daniel Morgan Graduate School of National Security. Each year that partnership is kicked off with a joint fellowship appointment, and we actually have our inaugural joint fellow, Dr. Yuval Weber, with us here this morning. He's been teaching a class at Daniel Morgan and also been making waves in the airwaves with his joint fellowship appointment here at the Kennan Institute. He's been on TV and radio quite a bit, and you've likely seen him quoted in the press as well. The Kennan Institute's mission, as you know, has always been to improve American understanding of Russia and the region, and to do so in a way that's policy relevant, right? This is George F. Kennan's basic approach to his own career. And our partnership with Daniel Morgan in the 21st century enables us to further that mission because, of course, Daniel Morgan focuses on educating rising generations of security professionals who will go on to serve this country. In addition to Baroness Ashton this morning, we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Stephen Meyer, who's Dean of Graduate Studies at Daniel Morgan, and will provide commentary following Baroness Ashton's remarks. Before we begin the main program, I want to invite Steve to say a few words about his institution. Let me introduce him, though, first. He served for a quarter century up the river, I guess, in the Central Intelligence Agency as a senior intelligence analyst and a manager. His specialization was European and Russian politics, nuclear weapons, security and defense issues, arms control, enforcement, and psychological analysis. I'm trying to extrapolate from that all the topics that you worked on within each of those broad categories, I can only imagine. He was a member of the intelligence support team for the conventional arms control talks in Vienna, as well as nuclear arms control talks in Geneva, including for the INF Treaty. During the Bosnia Wars in the 1990s, Dr. Meyer served as deputy chief of the CIA's Balkan Task Force. I know that's a common area of experience with Baroness Ashton. And throughout his career, he taught as an adjunct professor at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, and Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. He's a specialist in political, economic, security, and environmental issues, and regularly lectures on these topics and others in the U.S., Europe, and Asia. So, Steve, if you'd like to say a word about Daniel Morgan.
Thank you, Matt, for that generous introduction. I just wish my family were here to hear it. Maybe they'd have a little more respect for me. Daniel Morgan Graduate School was the dream of a few people several years ago. It's only 4 years old. We were set up in 2014. I was coaxed out of retirement and asked to come, and it's been a whirlwind ever since, and it's been a pleasure and a lot of hard work. We held our first graduation yesterday, and we are in the process of being pretty successful in helping these students find jobs. The school does strive to be non-ideological. We don't hew left or right. We are a school, not a foundation or an advocacy group. Our job is to provide students with a challenging, rigorous curriculum that examines the political discourse from many angles. We have a talented, experienced, well-credentialed staff of scholars and practitioners who currently lead our students in master's degrees in national security, intelligence, and information operations. We soon will be adding master's degrees in cybersecurity, and I think every school in the country is doing that, and regional studies, and we are establishing a required foreign language program. As such, we have a host of speakers and established alliances across the political spectrum as long as they provide academic value to us. We are especially proud of our relationship with the Kennan Foundation. This relationship has broadened us and our program on Russian politics and economics, and has allowed Kennan to expand its own programs. And we look forward to a mutually beneficial relationship in the future.
Thanks very much, Steve. All right, now it's my great pleasure to introduce Baroness Catherine Ashton. She is, of course, a life peer in the House of Lords. That is located near, but not in the same place we were all watching this Saturday morning. The fashion, though, is equally remarkable, I have to say. She has served as a minister in the UK Department for Education and Skills, as well as the Department for Constitutional Affairs and Ministry of Justice. She was appointed leader of the House of Lords and Lord President of the Queen's Privy Council in Gordon Brown's first cabinet in 2007. In 2008, she was the first woman appointed as a British European Commissioner and the first woman Commissioner for Trade in the European Commission. In that context, she concluded the South Korea trade deal, opened Canada negotiations, and resolved some long-standing disputes with the USA, which I imagine are no longer resolved. Or maybe at least partially so. In 2009, she became the European Union's first High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, in other words, the Foreign Minister of the European Union. Her diplomatic work, of course, was legendary, for which she received numerous awards, including the highest diplomat honors from the King of Jordan, as well as from Germany. And together with the Prime Ministers of Serbia and Kosovo, she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by both sides of the U.S. Congress. On leaving office, she was awarded the Grand Cross of St. Michael and St. George by Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. And today we have the enormous, incalculable honor of counting her as a colleague here in residence at the Woodrow Wilson Center, a member of the Global Leadership Foundation, and director of our Europe program. So, Kathy, without further ado.
Matt, thank you very much. It's terrific to be here, and it's especially wonderful for me because I sit here now as chair of the Global Europe program under the leadership of Jane Harman, who I now count as my boss, which is a very scary thought. The most important part of today's event for me is the discussion that we will have. And I want to introduce us to that, and of course have Steve's remarks on what I'm going to say to follow, by looking at two or three different elements of the relationship between Europe and the US, but in the context of Europe and Russia. And I want to do that by saying something, first of all, about this transatlantic relationship, because it is based on the values, ideals, and I would argue responsibilities that we, in what we loosely call the West, hold dear. There are high expectations on us all from our own people, but also from people across the world. We do what we do in foreign policy to, first of all, support our own people, to ensure that we keep them safe and prosperous as far as we possibly can. And it's a relationship that extends across institutions, through networks that have built over, in this case, across the pond for hundreds of years, and through the collaboration of people in trying to resolve problems that we all face. It is vital to us, and it is important that it continues. I feel that especially in the context of the discussion on Russia as a British person, because of the support we received across the Atlantic and from our European partners in the events that took place in Salisbury, when Mr. Skripal and his daughter Yulia were attacked. They are, as you know, both recovering. But it was a good example of the collaborative approach that we need to see between us all. So let me remark on two or three things. First of all, the relationship of Europe to Russia. And I'm going to focus it on the European Union, but I will include, of course, in my remarks those countries either departing the European Union, i.e. my own, or those countries aspiring to be in the European Union, of which there are several, or those countries who, if you like, orbit the European Union. The first thing that everyone recognizes if you look at the geography is, of course, Russia is on the same landmass. We think of it, and it often describes itself as a European country. And 28 sovereign states need to collaborate on a daily basis to consider issues that affect them directly or indirectly in their relationship with Russia. Some share borders and boundaries with it. often people travel across those borders on a daily basis. They go to work, they visit relatives, they visit friends. There are many Russian-speaking groups, minority groups, within European Union member states. The relationship is a trade and economic one that has huge implications for sanctions, which I'll come onto. Some European nations are 100% energy reliant on Russia, not least Bulgaria, Estonia, Finland and Latvia, with Lithuania and Romania close behind. And in 2017, there were record deliveries from Russia of energy support. This is a deep and important relationship in many cases. And it's why, just as an aside, it's interesting, having worked with two secretaries of state, when we consider the question of sanctions with Russia, that the implications for some European member states are much greater economically. Sanctions, by definition, are things that you place upon yourself and have impact and implications for your own economy. But if you're European nations trading quite heavily or working quite closely with Russia, sanctions have a bigger implication for you, and that's not to be underestimated. But the 28 nations of the European Union, together with their allies and colleagues around them, the orbiting countries, have worked well to ensure that collaboration, even if for them these are not issues in the first order of priority. And it's an important thing to note, because it's not like the United States. It's not a federal system. It's not a group of countries who have to agree. It's a group of countries who choose to agree. And that's not, as I say, to be underestimated in the course of our thinking about the relationships. These nations have particular concerns in the relationship with Russia, and in a sense in how, in this transatlantic relationship, we approach Russia. The first is how they observe Russia makes its voice heard and known in countries where it wants to have greater influence. I often describe this as the wedge. You see in Georgia and Moldova, and especially in Ukraine, that how Russia has engaged when it has its concerns, and if Russia was sitting up here, it would argue those concerns were real concerns about how we were trying to impose on those nations. Those nations would not, I think, agree with them. But the idea that you create within a nation an inability for that nation to consider itself wholly able to represent all its people and to move forward. Russia would say that all of those nations that have ever joined the EU that were formerly within the orbit of the Soviet Union have always joined NATO too, and that's true. It doesn't necessarily follow that those others who might want a stronger relationship with Europe would want either to join the European Union or to join NATO. But nonetheless, Russian concern about what they might do leads Russia to operate what I describe as the wedge. And what that means is that in Georgia, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, you have areas that are not under the control of the Georgian government. It means most recently in Ukraine, you've seen the taking of Crimea, and on the eastern flank of Ukraine, an inability for that part of Ukraine to be fully represented through the structures that exist in Kiev. And there's much discussion, and we will see much, I think, discussion this autumn with Russia about how to look at resolving those ongoing nightmares for people who live in the eastern part of Ukraine in ways that recognize, as has always been recognized in Europe, the need to have strong and dynamic economic and cultural links back into Russia from people who have long established links. That does not mean that those people wish to become part of Russia. It means they wish to have those links with Russia. And that's a fundamental difference that needs to be recognized and understood. So the wedge approach, the way in which these nations have not been able to move forward in the way that they wish, is something that concerns nations who sit near them or who look at their own situation. I've mentioned that we have many Russian-speaking minorities, and there's a concern that exists in some nations as to how far they have integrated and supported those minority communities into the nationhood that exists. And of course, the use of the internet and the use of cyber approaches, which were very well talked about in this country, to try and engender some feelings of concern or possibly unrest. That's not to be underestimated, and a concern that nations feel. They feel too the cyber attacks or the engagement of Russia in wanting to create some form of dissent, or simply cyber attacks that attack the infrastructure. Remember back into the situation Estonia faced some years ago. And as energy-reliant countries, they worry about energy as a political tool. The concern that you can switch energy on and you can switch it off. Issues being addressed in the European Union in terms of diversification of energy and support, but nonetheless, real issues for those who are totally reliant. And I think a new element of worry and concern is how far they can rely on the traditional alliances that would be there to support them. Much talk about the strength of NATO. Would NATO be there if necessary? Greater concern about how far defence spending in NATO has engendered a feeling that those who don't, won't or can't pay this figure of 2%, which we could spend a whole day talking about, can no longer look to NATO to see it as the most reliable partner. It's a murmur now, but it's there in the feelings and thinking of those. And a sort of general sense of, could there be greater interference at a time of uncertainty in the strength of relations? Now, none of those things may come to pass as issues that countries in the end have to feel great concern about. Russia may not use any of those different approaches that are entirely negative in their way of working with a nation at all. But if you go to countries that have greater connection to Russia, you will hear them. You will hear them talk about, this is what we worry around as to the relationship with Russia for the future. They see Russia as more assertive in the world, and they worry as to what that may translate into. For Russia itself, my second point, which is about how I think Russia is viewing itself at the moment, we have the beginning of the next presidency of President Putin. I hesitate to say the last, because I don't know. But he has determined on the positioning of Russia as a great nation in the world. And if you look at what he's been saying in most recent days and his decrees from May, he has put a much greater emphasis on the economy. The opinion polls that he's been looking at and that I've been looking at show that 46% of Russians now worry about the economy. They want him to do more to support the economy and, incidentally, healthcare, the two big issues that in most countries, actually in Europe, and I suspect if you took a poll in America right now, economy and healthcare are always big domestic questions. So Russia is absolutely no exception to that. And he has put forward a deeply ambitious investment plan for the next few years, where he's going to focus on health, on housing, on jobs, small and medium-sized enterprise, and especially on the digital economy. That, I think, is an opportunity, in a way, to think about relationships with Russia in the future, because this emphasis on the economy also creates an opportunity for greater foreign and direct investment into Russia if a relationship can be found with Russia where that was likely or possible to lead to a strengthening and a better sense of how Russia is going to operate in the world. Because what Russia also sees in its foreign policy terms is a United States that it thinks is less engaged in the world or engaged differently in the world. The Iran deal, which much will be talked about today, no doubt, after the Secretary of State's speech, the Russians are in the deal and, as far as one can tell, staying in the deal. In fact, they potentially benefit from what things have happened right now. They want to position themselves very much as a key engaged country and Putin an engaged leader in resolving conflicts and problems in the world, whatever you might think of that. If you asked me what my photograph of the year was for last year, it was a picture of President Erdogan, President Rouhani, and President Putin as the Syrian peacemakers. I'll leave it at that. But there are real implications for Russia's positioning now in the context of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran, where it has good relationships with all, and I think we'll want to try and use that again to position Russia in a place where it is seen to be the country to whom all can turn. And that's, again, very interesting in the context of how the United States and Europe wishes to position itself. So for Russia, a big emphasis on the economy, strong moves to try and deal with these massive imports, 46% importing of all of the big major elements of the economy, from machine tools to the equipment they need and so on, wanting to do something about that by homegrown domestic markets, but also looking at this question of how to address this area for the population, because it's going to be the big issue and the issue on which the presidency, in a sense, will be seen to have been successful. And also a changing political landscape outside, especially in the broadest sense, the Middle East region, which I think is going to be very interesting. My final point then is about what does that mean for how this relationship between the US and Europe in the context of Russia goes forward. Well, I think post the Iran deal, we need to find a new dialogue. And the new dialogue needs to consider the implications. So again, looking at what Secretary of State Pompeo said today will be extremely important. But that dialogue is important to us not just because of the need to address the question of the transatlantic relationship more generally, but because one of the side effects of the Iran deal was, for certainly the 4 years plus I was involved with it, that we had a place where we were talking constantly to Russia and to China, regardless of what was going on in the world. Indeed, during the course of the Iran negotiations, we had the Ukraine crisis, which led to significant sanctions against Russia, placed by both the US and the EU, and yet we all remained in the room as partners in the Iran negotiations. And we don't have the place where that could happen now. It's also, I think, the only time in history where China, Russia, the US, and Europe have actually worked together on the same issue to common cause. And so, having lost that, there is, I think, a gap, a hole, a vacuum, where we don't have an informal place to talk in the same way. I think, secondly, this focus on economic, in terms of energy and trade, is interesting and potentially useful. If Russia wishes to develop its economy substantially, it's going to need investment coming from the US and from Europe. And that means it has to do something about the sanctions, and it has to do something about developing the relationship in a different way. And that could have implications for dealing with or tackling or ending some of the problems and concerns that we currently have. And we need to make sure that we push those and address those effectively, so that it's not just about us being seen to be open in what we do, but rather demanding in what we ask Russia to do. And my final point would be, we also need to make sure that we have a clarity of approach to Russia, that we are clear in the transatlantic relationship, whether that's Europe and America working together or that's through NATO, that we are collaborators together in our approach, and that we stand together solidly and firmly and clearly in what we expect. So links were possible with Russia, working together. Distance were necessary from Russia in ensuring that we are confident and determined in what it is we want to see them do. Thank you.
Kathy, thank you. You've covered a wide range of issues, any one of which could occupy us for the remaining half hour. Steve, I want to invite you to give a comment on what Kathy has said, maybe tee up some questions that we ought to consider
Sure.
further in discussion, please.
Sure. Thank you. Lady Ashton raised, as Matt points out, a number of very critical issues. And what I'd like to suggest is that in considering those issues, we have to take a very different look at the context of politics, international politics in the cusp of the 21st century. And maybe at times we can put this in the way of questions. It's the kind of things I'm trying to write about and the kind of things I am concerned with and worry about in teaching and writing and speaking. I think that we are in the midst of fundamental change in the international system. One of those, we're in the midst of it, so we don't know exactly how clear it's going to be. This is one of those, I think, sort of tectonic historical, could be one of those historical watershed periods of time. We hear frequently about the transatlantic relationship. But I wonder if at this point in time, the post-World War II American liberal condominium, the whole Bretton Woods framework is over. And we will not get that recovered. That will not go back. We will not go back to that any further. That what we have to do is find new context, new parameters. Yes, we share ideals with the Europeans. I've heard that all my professional life. We all believe in democracy and human rights and so forth. But I wonder if at times that's the same as interests. And I think maybe there's a wide berth between a commitment to values and a commitment to interests. We interpret interests differently. I think that we have to face very difficult questions in not only the policies as well as the structure, the architecture of the relationship between the United States and Europe. One of them for me is the EU in the midst of very important change? Has it peaked? After Maastricht and Amsterdam, has it peaked in what it can accomplish? Is there a genuine fatigue? I travel a lot to the Balkans, I travel a lot to Serbia, and there's a lot of apprehension about whether they will ever get in because of this concept of fatigue. NATO. I just came back from Poland Thursday. I was asked about Poland constantly. Will they protect us? And I said, well, I'm not the one to ask that. I have views, but you got to ask above my pay grade for that. I said, but just think about it. NATO is what, a tripwire? If Russians came across the border, is it realistic to assume that two heavily armed nuclear states are going to go to war over the Polish border? Remember, Article 5 is not an article that says you must go to war. It allows for it, but that common defense is we join together to find an answer, and the second part of that article is until it can be turned over to the United Nations. Most Poles that I spoke with whom I spoke, did not realize this, and I think I upset them a little bit. We see a renationalization of politics in Europe. I saw this in Poland. We had very frank discussions about the Law and Justice Party. The day I was there and met the Prime Minister, I had to leave early because Viktor Orban was coming to see him, and I wish I could have stayed for that one, but I was not allowed to do that. We are seeing Alternative for Deutschland for the first time in the German parliament. We just saw what happened in Italy. The whole post-World War II political system is essentially blown up, except probably for the one constant in Italian politics, which is change. We see a re-energized Russia, as the Baroness has pointed out. We thought we were riding high with Yeltsin. Pro-Western, loved liberal Western ideas, but then he failed. Putin came to office, and Putin's mantra was essentially what I think post-World War I German leaders saw: humiliation, dismissal, chest thumping by the victors. And this is, I think, the wellspring of a lot of Russian attitude. Doesn't make it our fault. It's just that I wonder if an opportunity wasn't missed at the end of the Cold War. And I really am not sure the Cold War has ended, frankly. We have to find the way forward with Russia in a context that is very, very different. So I'll leave it there, and maybe that stirs some questions.
Let me start. I want to make sure that we get to the room, so I'll keep this relatively short and just recount a remark that was made actually at this desk about a month and a half ago by a former director of policy planning and chief of staff to John Kerry, Jake Sullivan, to Hillary Clinton, who talked about meeting with a Russian counterpart in the course of the Iran-JCPOA negotiations. And I think he's used the story in a number of places, so it's probably known to some of you. And he basically laid out, I think, in an anecdotal way, the fundamental dilemma of this effort to engage Russia in solving common European or even global problems. And maybe the reason, Steve, why you say, the order is breaking down and there just isn't an alternative. He said basically he and Bill Burns had a fantastic conversation with Sergei Ryabkov, the deputy foreign minister, about the JCPOA and how basically they were going to work together to get it done. And on their way out of the room, they said, and by the way, we're levying sanctions against you over Ukraine. See you later. And it seems to me that this underscores the basic dilemma of you have foundational disagreements about the nature of European security with one of the main global order providers. I mean, after all, if the NATO Charter includes a reference to sending the problem to the UN, well, the board of the directors of the UN is the UN Security Council, and Russia's on it with a permanent veto. So if you have that kind of foundational disagreement, do you really have a system at all?
What to do?
Yeah. The Lenin question.
Well,
Yeah, that's right.
so I would answer it, if you want me to, by saying what I've witnessed happening more and more is we have two different ways of doing things as an international community. I'm making this far too simplistic, but you'll get my drift. One is what I call the kind of the structures that exist. So it's the NATOs and the European Unions and the big, heavy, tanker-like things that are based on values and years of diplomatic work that bring everybody together and so on. And they're incredibly valuable because they're known and they're heavy and they can do heavy lifting. And then you've got what I put alongside the tankers, these yachts that move about, and they're the informal groupings. And the informal groupings solve problems that are unique. So the group of people who were working on Iran were largely arguing with each other about everything else. We didn't have a common framework on everything else at all. But on Iran, leaving aside what the US has decided to do, but on Iran it worked. You hear about the Friends of Syria or the contact group or the whatever, that I increasingly saw that you brought together people for one purpose and it could actually have great value. And using the permanent members of the Security Council, who frankly spend most of the rest of the time disagreeing, and Russia especially has vetoed more things in the last 3 or 4 years than it did in the previous 25. But you could do it because there was a common need to solve the problem. And it was a great way of engaging China, who showed up for meetings that took a week, a month of my life for 4 years. It was a waste of time, possibly, but there we go. We miss birthdays and parties and weddings and celebrations and all sorts of things to do the work. But everybody came and always came. And so I wonder if in part of the kind of changing of the landscape is that we're going to need to rethink what we use the heavy tanker stuff for, but we're also going to have to use many more yachts if we're going to solve problems.
Yeah.
Anything to add, Steve?
No, I'd like to open it up.
All right, let's do that. So we have a couple of microphones on either side of the room, so just keep your hand high because the lights are bright here and I can't necessarily see you, and then identify yourself and your institution. Okay, we'll go first to Yuval.
Hi, thank you very much. Yuval Weber of Daniel Morgan and the Kennan Institute. So this is a question for the Baroness.
Can we call me Kathy? Because
Kathy, okay.
Baroness is a bit much, really.
I didn't know if I had to like doff a cap to you or
Well,
something.
you can,
Oh,
but I
come
wouldn't.
Yeah. So my question for
We
you
all
is-
have royal wedding fever. I'm really sorry about that.
enthusiasm is high. So part of the discussion here is whether sort of like the tankers, how much is the structure going to sort of maintain? How much is sort of like the smaller things maybe will replace aspects of like the larger post-World War II order? But I have a question for you in terms of how you experienced Russia, because you basically had both positive economic interaction with Russia, like from your time in the EU, in terms of energy stuff. You also had negative economic experience given the competition over Ukraine. You had experience with the Iran nuclear deal. You also had experience with annexation and war. So in terms of having seen pretty much every face of Russia externally, do you believe that this is a strategy of Russia, or that this is something of Russia that is sustainable? Is this something that they can sort of carry on for indefinitely, or is it something in which they're trying to provide enough global disorder in order to help accelerate the declines we're seeing sort of globally?
I think if you look at it from their perspective, and I hesitate to try and pretend to be Russia in this context, it's a fairly successful plan, because if your objective is to do two things: one, to prevent the West getting so close up to you that it starts to feel as if they're encroaching right on your border, then preventing nations from being able to join Western institutions without having to engage in a full-scale military activity is a pretty successful outcome. And if you believe, as Russia, that the way that we approach issues in the West is to move in on them, get rid of the leaders and allow a degree of chaos to ensue, then keeping Assad in Syria looks like a pretty good success story from your point of view as well. Now, I'm deliberately making these sound very negative from our real point of view, but that's not so far-fetched from the perspective that they have. They don't want to see Ukraine move too close to the West and to Europe, because they believe that the forces in Ukraine that wanted to push it massively away from Russia and absolutely into the heart of the European Union, and therefore NATO, because the two they see as indistinguishable, they believe that they have rescued part of Ukraine from doing that in that sense, in their terms. So, you know, it looks from their perspective as if this is a way that things work. From a perspective that I would have, we have got in the next 20 years or so to work out a relationship with a massive country that is on European borders that we have to have an economic relationship with, and that may be the way that we deal with the other issues, but that does not allow for it to encroach upon the democracies and the nationhood of those states who have chosen a different path. It's for nations to choose their own path properly and not for it to be imposed upon them by them. And so that's, I think, going to be where we have to find ways through it. The point about the informal groupings is it gives you a place, just as the Jake Sullivan anecdote tells you, where you can be doing one thing that can be positive, while at the same time you're having to deal with some very negative issues elsewhere, but you've still got a capacity to talk.
Jana.
Thank you very much. Diana Negroponte from the Woodrow Wilson. Kathy, last week, emerging from the EU summit, Donald Tusk stood before that microphone and talked of the solidarity of the EU, the European Union, in the face of American threats. The terms for America were clouded in respect, but we clearly understood that he was referring to the solidarity of the EU due to the current administration. Based on your experience of working in Brussels, how far do Donald Tusk's words carry?
So I think the concern for European countries right now is that they are not any more certain of the desire of the United States administration. I don't mean the people or the institutions or anything else, I mean the administration, to support this concept of a European Union. That the nation state and the links between the nation state seems to have become more the currency that enables people to talk across the Atlantic. And there seems to be, by the way, a particular issue with Germany about German economic connections to the US as well. So there is undoubtedly a sense of being puzzled by why suddenly the European Union, which after all was in part your invention and your idea, is no longer seen to be a heavyweight, clear partner economically and politically in the world. And I think they're trying to work through whether that's real or whether that's just some of the rhetoric and how it's translated or how it translates when you look at it from a European perspective. But we're all in a bit of a, we don't really understand and we don't really know what this means. I think Donald Tusk is a measured person who, when he says something of that nature, he knows who he's speaking for and will do so in that sense. He's not just saying it on his own. But it's also about, I think for Europeans, a concern that we should be allowed to make our own foreign policy. We align with the United States of America massively. In fact, when I was in office, you know, the conversations were every 20 minutes. They weren't every day. It was a constant stream of contact on all kinds of issues where we found common cause. We didn't always agree 100%. You would change things and nuance them differently to us and so on. The implications geographically and politically would sometimes be different. As I've already indicated on sanctions, they have a bigger impact the closer you are to the country and the more trading links you have with that country, and so on. But they would be pretty much worked out. And the assumption was this was a solid bond. And the question is now, is this a solid bond where we make our decisions and we come together, or is this much more that we don't get to choose what we want to do? And that's, I think, the worry that we'll see coming out of what the Secretary of State says today and you know, how he's trying to define that relationship. Because it's a big thing if Europe is not going to be able to make choices that are different on occasion.
We have begun to, Europe and the United States, I think, I want to emphasize the point that the Baroness made about alignment. If you look back just to the Iraq War that the United States was involved with, we are hardly aligned with Europe. Certain European countries, Britain, but not the French, not the Germans, major allies. As I said, I had just returned from Poland. The Tusk comments are extremely controversial in Poland, and part of it has to do with the fact that he is on the outs with the current political order. It's interesting, too, Baroness mentioned Russia is on the border of Europe. So I think back to the 19th century, Russia was Europe. The Dreikaiserbund, the alliances. This whole concept of Europe, of Russia, as part of Europe, has been lost, I think, and that's what I wonder if there's any way to recover that. Merkel gets this, I think, to a point, and I want to start watching how closely she and Macron begin to discuss these issues in the future. This is not the first time last week that Angela Merkel has said we have to go our own way, and essentially, I think that's a healthy attitude.
Does either of you, just very quick follow-up, does either of you think Germany going its own way would have a significant component of, I believe it was called Neue Ostpolitik back in the day, a Sonderweg on Russia? I mean, we did see Merkel visit Putin in Sochi just 3-4 days ago, I think.
Yeah, it's. I think it's going to be Merkel and the not going their own way, but finding the allies in Europe. Remember, the Germans have always been the champions of the federal Europe idea, much unlike the French and the British. But I think what she's going to try to find is some way of accommodation.
Right.
Macron was so rebuffed when he came here by President Trump. And he's a smart man, so I hope and I suspect that he will see common cause with her.
Yeah, I'm not. I mean, the sort of federal Europe idea comes and goes. It's mainly in the minds of people who live. If you live in Luxembourg, then you're likely to be working in France or working in Belgium or somewhere else. There are some countries where the boundaries are so irrelevant to what you might do that it's very easy to see it as one thing. But if you live in Sweden or you live in Britain or Denmark or elsewhere, then it was always something that was a very long way away from your thinking. There's always been a need for Europe to consider its relationships with President Putin and with Russia, and certainly Chancellor Merkel has played a big part in that. Think about how many conversations and discussions she's had with him over the whole future of Ukraine and trying to resolve that, because she's a prominent leader with whom he will have dealings and talk to and so on. And she will continue to do that, and rightly so in my view. That's important. You've got to keep these dialogues open and keep talking. But I do think that the growing concern about what the anticipated relationship might be from the US on, for example, trade with Europe, as well as the sort of politics of this and the collaboration for the future, is going to create a desire for Europe to say, well, we're going to have to fix things ourselves in some ways. It's a sort of, it could, in a way, dare I say, also be a sort of opportunity to try and do things, particularly in the Balkans, which is where we both have great interest and where Europe really should be taking the lead again.
So right here.
Frank Fletcher with Daniel Morgan Graduate School. My question for the panel is, would you say that the right-wing or populist parties that have been mentioned that are, although growing in influence, would be more open to cooperation in some regards with President Putin, and do you see perhaps what issue might lead those parties to grow and influence some touchstone? Would it be immigration? Could there be some sort of confluence here? They're small now, but what is the future of those parties, and how would Russia factor into that from their own perspective as perhaps a tool of statecraft?
From the Russian perspective or the perspective of the far right in Europe?
Well, the perspective of the Russians, and are those parties more open to
Right.
cooperation?
Yeah. I mean,
They see common ground.
right. Yeah, one part of this I want to underscore is historically the rise of the right in Europe hasn't actually been so great for Russia.
No.
But it seems that assumption's been flipped on its head of late. It seems strange.
It's quite hard because, of course, we use these labels of far right, far left, whatever, to describe things that are an odd, in some places, odd mixture. And one of the complaints that the Russians had about Ukraine and the demonstrations was that they saw it as being led by the far right, which they didn't like. So it moves around. There are undoubtedly populist movements in parts of Europe that have a stronger feeling a positive feeling towards Russia than there are others, but they vary. And certainly because of the nature of the way that they operate, which is social media, sloganizing, and taking issues and extrapolating them into something else, that plays into those who might want to interfere in what's going on without a particular view about the groups that they're helping. It's simply to stop the groups that they don't want to help. So you've got all of that in play, which I think probably has some impact. But undoubtedly, one of the things that is true about these groups is that they're very anti-EU and very anti-Brussels, which has come in for all the flack. You know, Brussels no were big posters in the Hungarian elections. There's a sense that Brussels has become a thing that's somehow disconnected from the capacity of nations to make decisions. The fact that Brussels is a place where the nations come together and make decisions as sovereign states seems to be lost on everyone for the moment. So it's a very weird mixture at the minute.
Yeah. If Jane were here, I suspect she'd mention it's exactly the same with the attitude towards the U.S. Congress. Steve, did you want to add anything?
No, go ahead, let them ask questions.
Good. We had one question there. I think we've got time. Why don't we take these three questions together and let the two panelists answer? So right there, and then here.
Marta Verbetic, Wilson Center. Could you please comment a little bit more about the future of transatlantic relationship and the future of Europe from the perspective of the deepening differences between East and West Europe? I mean, Eastern Europeans who, and these differences came out particularly with respect to the migration crisis. I'm not mentioning now the role of the media and all of this, the crisis of liberal democracy I talked about. And I would say the problem is not just, Maastricht Treaty in Amsterdam. It's more what was happening after Lisbon Treaty and the formulation of the common asylum policies, which fall within an important pillar, which was part of the Lisbon Treaty, which Eastern European countries do not want to participate. Right. And what does it leave Europe with respect to its future and the transatlantic relationship?
And would you pass the microphone to the gentleman here? Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Dia. I work in security analysis. Speaking of Euro-skeptic attitudes and the right-wing parties that are Eurosceptic, that portray Brussels and the institutions representing the United Europe as this almost leviathan of Euro bureaucrats, while there are only about 30,000 of them, which is slimmer and much smaller than the bureaucracies of the smallest members, including Luxembourg. What would you think, I mean, the democracy deficiency, so to speak, argument, is it the feature rather than the bag when it comes to the European Union institutions? Whether it can be addressed effectively and whether the latest initiative by President Macron to hold consultations in each member state, and now in Brussels, with ordinary, randomly chosen Europeans, something that can address it effectively. Thank you.
Okay, and then Will.
Will Pomerantz from the Kennan Institute. I just want to turn to the question to Kathy about the importance of trade, because you emphasized that. But in light of what also has been discussed about changing global attitudes, clearly the U.S. attitude towards trade is changing. Russia, in response to the Ukraine crisis, introduced a protectionist policy and something called an import substitution policy, which is very anti-trade. And obviously, in Britain, there's also very great questions about relationships to trading partners and how that's going to proceed going forward. So from your perspective, is trade still the cutting edge and the leading wedge in terms of trying to seek better relations?
All three questions deal in a broad sense with this problem of kind of a European elite that benefits from openness, right, but also from political power, and then a base which tries to recover some of that power and close down the openness. Do you want to
Yeah.
Future of East versus West on migrants, or whichever.
So, I mean, they do all link together in exactly the way that you brilliantly put, Matt. So let me start with the East-West, which, you know, when you've got 28 countries that are so different, you also have North-South. I mean, you can take any chunk, any group of countries and find things that are very similar and very different in how they approach everything. But the migration issue was the one that people really saw as being the point at which populism took over in the minds of many in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, because their familiarity with migration was very different to the familiarity of France or Britain or Spain or Germany. It was exploited, undoubtedly, to make points that were not relevant to the issue, but were relevant to who was going to win the elections. And that is not surprising in some ways, but what was surprising is that the group of nations don't really seem to have found a way yet to have sorted this out and to have addressed it properly. Because the migration crisis, what you would have seen on your screens, we were seeing on our screens, which was this terrible tragedy of people coming both from Libya on boats that was unworthy of getting anywhere, never mind across the ocean, right the way through to people facing barbed wire when they were trying to come through the Balkans, and lots of people sleeping in Hungarian railway stations in Budapest and so on. The problem was identified as a great surge of people trying to escape poverty, war, crisis in some form. The truth is that the great thing about Europe, or the European Union, is that it finds ways through problems as a group of 28 countries working together. The bad thing is it can't do it quickly, because inevitably you're trying to work out how on earth you're going to resolve these problems that are suddenly on your doorstep. You need to work out how 28 governments are going to work them out, bearing in mind that at any given moment there's an election going on in one of them, bearing in mind that at any given moment there's a very wobbly coalition in at least 3 of them, and bearing in mind it's an opposition party's gift to find an issue that the government can be accused of just giving in to Brussels on. I'm afraid that's what you see in the East-West thing. And it brings me to the Brussels democratic deficit, which is the problem that Brussels faces is actually the role of the member state. Member states do not sell Brussels or the European Union as a wholly positive thing. When I was a cabinet minister, the joke was always local government blames us in Westminster, we blame Brussels. Anything good was obviously a national idea, it couldn't possibly have come from Brussels. Anything bad or imposed, even if we were the ones who'd proposed it, was automatically labelled a Brussels problem. And I'll give you a tiny quick anecdote. I once went to a town as a minister where I saw a local swimming pool closed with a sign that said, pool closed due to EU regulation. And there were lots of angry mums and dads with small babies who'd obviously gone for their swimming lesson. So when I got back to the office in London, I asked them to ring and find out what it was. And what it was is there is an EU regulation that says you cannot put small babies in freezing cold water. It's also a British regulation, and it's common sense. But that was the way that the council chose to deal with it, because it took it away from them, who'd actually not heated the pool properly, and put it in the hands of Brussels. But 6 Brexiteers were born that day. And that's the problem, that member states don't sell the idea, and Brussels becomes the problem. And then finally on trade, Will, you asked me about that, you know, trade has always been for us the way that we operate as a European group together. It's a single market, is a phenomenal block. It's why the Brexiteers in Britain are finding it very difficult to work out how on earth we retain the good stuff without being a member of the club. The answer is you can't, but that's by the by. Right. And trade will continue to be extremely significant. But we are beginning to see more and more the made in Russia stuff, you know, is going to grow. We are seeing strong views expressed here. How they'll translate, I don't know, which will have impacts or have an impact on some of the trading relationships that we've had with the US from Europe. And my final point is, this is part of this whole divide question that we keep coming back to, which is for many people in our countries, they don't think they've seen any of the benefits of this great global outward-looking society that we all bang on about. They don't travel in the way we do. They don't see people coming in and providing additional benefits to them. What they see is loss. Loss of jobs, loss of opportunity. And although technology is the biggest player in that, they think it's to do with this bunch of elites, this bunch of people who just live completely different lives. And I think you see that here, and you certainly see it in Britain, and I think you see it across Europe. And that's the thing domestic politicians have got to tackle.
I'm not a Eurosceptic in the normal sense of the term. I'm just trying to identify problems that I think are facing the European Union, so that little bit of defense. The migration and the economic issues have had, as the Baroness pointed out, profound impact. And it's east-west up to a point, but I think if you draw an economic line, it runs pretty well from northwest to southeast and then through the Mediterranean. And we're seeing a widening economic trade gap. I mean, if you look at the economy of Italy, the economy of Spain, Portugal, Greece has actually done somewhat better lately, but nonetheless, and then into the Balkans. These are the beggars of Europe, in a sense. These are the poor people of Europe. They're not Holland, they're not Belgium, they're not Germany. I think that's one of the real issues that has to be dealt with by the community. And I go back to a speech that Prime Minister Thatcher gave, I think it was in Antwerp in the 80s, mid-80s, 86, about, I could have that date wrong, but it was around then, the nature of what this was like, what this was supposed to be like, and it was supposed to be a massive economic trade bloc. And it was in a way putting the brakes on political development, but it was also, this was British vision then, 30-some years ago. Yeah, the European elites, they're an interesting lot, aren't they? I think the democratic deficit has been around for a long time. It has always struck me that the Lisbon Treaty is the result of the fact that the Dutch and the French turned down a vote on the Constitution for Europe. So essentially, the elites went around their people with the Lisbon Agreement, the Lisbon Treaty. Brussels is the target. I mean, it's the target of all of the disenchanted parties in Europe, whether true or not. The bureaucracy, the minute, rules about pools. Rules in Italy about the weight of cheese and so forth, about the content of cheese. These minute details get a tremendous, they provide the parties with a tremendous boost. I think these are substantial issues that they have to be taken on with courage and with determination, in my view.
Well, I love this pool metaphor because it's the perfect kind of concrete bit of almost clay that you can grapple with to try to understand how to accommodate this anger and disaffection. But I think every time I try in my mind to pull it in one direction, I realize it's probably like everything else in human history. I'm a big believer that it's not directional, that it's probably cyclical. Generational in that sense, and that as long as Europe had and by Europe I include in this Russia and I include North America, had a compelling memory, generationally speaking, of how badly nationalism and sort of conflict could go awry, then we were willing to make sacrifices to get things right. My prayer, of course, is that we don't have to sink as low as we sank in the past to be reminded again. But what the pathway looks like to get there is difficult to foresee at this point, although metaphors like the pool help us. So bear with me for 30 extra seconds. I imagine a post-Brexit pool, or really a pool anywhere in Europe, with the collapse of kind of inter-European exchanges that follows the path of sort of Russian cheese after the reciprocal cheese embargo, which is, yes, it's cheese, but no one really wants to eat it as much. You know, look, where do you get the fuel at the price you can afford to heat the water, right? Where do you get the lifeguards? Has anybody in the Washington area ever met one of the lifeguards at your pools? They're invariably folks coming from exactly the same countries, usually in Eastern Europe, who would be staffing pools in, you know, a fully border-free Europe. What about the tax base to pay to pave the parking lot and the roads to get to the pool? And then, can we talk about snacks? Food in the UK before the European Union? Just go to the local pub and get what, warm beer and. But no, it is actually a useful metaphor, because at some point, people across the board are going to have to see what it means to live in the world that satisfies the political demands that they're making, and then maybe we don't have to go to too far an extreme before people pull back a little bit. But I think you've all helped us enormously to lay out the questions, and it does feel like we're at a turning point. So thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. Would you please join me in thanking Kathy and Steve?